So I was thinking about this after I completed recording the video, why there are so few games released nowadays. I thought, well, I should talk about this as well. Why there's so little innovation. There are several factors, but just like why there's so few games released, it's the same main cause. It's because of the high cost. That's the main reason why there's so little innovation. So not only are there fewer games released, but also the games that are released are all more alike now because of the high cost to produce games. The stakes are far higher, there's a far greater capital investment. The high cost in time and money of producing new games is the number one reason why we see the exact same game with only minor changes released multiple times, like Assassin's Creed, the various FromSoft titles and its imitators, and so on. Corporations absolutely need to generate as much money with the assets they've already produced as is possible because of the extremely high cost of production for those assets. So, of course, they're going to release the same game reskinned 20 times. They can't afford to continually produce new games and new assets under the current conditions. When a game costs $200 million to produce, all the assets and the marketing and all that, of course they're not going to produce 5 distinct games. Of course they're going to use all the assets from their first game for all their subsequent titles. And if the first game was a huge hit, of course they're going to copy the design from the first game. And this is why we see all kinds of different games merging towards a standard model. Like franchises are integrating aspects from other genres that are successful in order to capitalize on the audience that those games have. Like the God of War titles have obviously integrated open world role-playing game aspects into what was formerly a stage-by-stage, level-by-level brawler. So this is why there's a lack of innovation. They're trying to copy what was already successful. So we're going to see conformation to a standard model that's successful. All these new games are trying to fit into a mold of what was already sold. So this is why we see only a handful of new games in terms of gameplay. Of course, there's like a dozen racing games out, but they're all practically identical to whichever one was extremely successful years ago. And of course, there are all kinds of games like Dark Souls, Dark Souls 2, and so on, because of those games were successful. So, of course, all kinds of other games are going to emulate those and copy all kinds of aspects from those games. The cost of producing these games is so high that they can't afford to take a risk. They can't spend $100 million on a game and then have it only sell 100,000 copies. Even if a game turns a profit, it can still be a failure because, look at it this way, if you're an investor in one of these publishers, one of these developers, if you have $100 million, are you really going to invest it in a game studio that may only return 0.5% or 1% to you? Let's say you invest $100 million. Are you going to be satisfied with $1 million return on your investment? No, of course you're going to invest your money somewhere else where you can get a higher return on your investment, where there's a higher rate of profit. So this is the problem with modern media, gaming and movies. The rate of profit has fallen because the cost of production is so absurdly high because of the consumer expectations, because of the audience expectations. So this is why investments are going down. This is why these AAA game studios are folding. This is why when the mold that they continually pour their games into, when it no longer works, these companies either copy some other game style or they just fold completely. So beat 'em up games stopped selling really well, so God of War transitioned into what it is now, and it's the same with other games. I don't really follow new games, but I'm sure you could come up with all kinds of examples of franchises that have fundamentally changed in order to match what's popular at the time. And franchises will continue in whatever mold is successful, like I said, until it's no longer possible to continue. Only when a mold is no longer profitable, only when a model for a game is no longer profitable, will they change. They won't take a risk and create a new game, a new style of gameplay within a franchise, or create a new franchise with a new style of gameplay just to see if it'll work like they used to do 20 or 30 years ago. In the past, because the cost of producing a game was so low, you could risk, $1 million and create a new franchise or change the sequel in a franchise that's already established in some respects to see if this is popular, if this is what people want. It was a relatively minor risk, and the return on investment was so high compared to what it is now that it was worth taking the risk, Like Twisted Metal, for instance, That was a relatively cheap game to produce. It sold extremely well. And Twisted Metal 2 made some changes. It sold extremely well. But risks like that aren't taken anymore because the cost is so high to produce these games to start with that taking a risk is just financial suicide. That's why all new games are iterative. They're all based upon previous entries in a franchise that's already successful, or they're based upon older franchises, older games that have already succeeded, that sold well. And it's that way with movies also. That's why there are so many movies now that are practically identical. In many respects, they're all trying to capitalize upon what was already successful instead of taking a risk and doing something new due to the high cost of production. So, in summary, no, we will never see innovation in the AAA games, In the AAA releases, there won't be any innovation whatsoever. There will merely be copying of what's successful, whether it's previous AAA entries or indie games. Hardware is another major reason that we don't see innovation from AAA studios. So imagine Kenshi being produced by a AAA studio. What would be their absolute first demand? They would say, well, you can't have this low level of detail in the game. You can't have these extremely dated graphics. The game has to look brand new. The graphics have to be as lifelike as possible. Well, they would quickly realize that there's no computer that could run a world as large as Kenshi with, let's say it has to have the level of detail of God of War Ragnarok or GTA 5 or, Elden Ring. Kenshi would not work. A game with scripting that complex and a world that large, it just will not function with, that level of graphical fidelity. It's just too much strain on the hardware. So even if money and time aren't issues for developing, that level of graphical fidelity, there's still the hardware limitation. So that's why we don't see innovation from AAA studios. It's not even really possible to innovate with, this level of graphical fidelity and with the current hardware limitations. There's only very limited small-scale games that can even function with this level of detail. Like, we're not going to see games as vast as Morrowind or Daggerfall or Kenshi or anything like those games with the level of graphical fidelity of a brand new release, a brand new AAA release. But let's just say for the sake of argument that money is still an issue, but that the hardware limitations are not. Kenshi doesn't have any analog. There's no game similar to it that came out prior to it. In fact, I don't think there are any games like it that have come out after either. But it was unique when it came out. So, of course, even if it was possible to develop that game, even if you could get past the hardware limitations and actually develop that game with, AAA graphics, it wouldn't be developed by a AAA studio because a research team at the marketing department couldn't look at something similar that had already come out and justify investing, $300 or $400, $500 million to develop Kenshi to AAA standards. They couldn't tell the corporate heads at Ubisoft or ZeniMax, oh yeah, let's just spend this amount of money on this game that doesn't have any analog. There's nothing similar to it that's already successful. Let's just develop it anyway. You might get away with that when games only cost, $500,000, $1 million, $2 or $3 million to produce. But when games cost $100+ million to make, you can't get away with that. It's not possible to justify that to people who have to invest their money in that product. It's an illogical business decision. So the hardware limitations and the financial risk are why we don't see innovation from AAA games.